previous, thinking of how this transition is going to happen and how it's happening across the world. Sorry, let me just introduce myself. My name is Wikus Kruger. I'm from the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. I'm very interested myself in this session, and I think we're very lucky to have some of the leading experts from across the world, giving us experiences from Denmark, one of the leading markets in the renewable energy sector, to Mexico, which is really just liberalized, just gone through some of its first auctions, seeing how those markets have dealt with this transition, and then drilling down into South African experiences with thinking about how we integrate wind energy into our power systems. So without further ado, I'm going to now be handing over to Dr. Skytte from the Technical University of Denmark, DTU. And he's going to be discussing from passive to active actors in the power markets and business opportunities for wind power plants. And really talking about how wind power plants are becoming more active in the power markets that we are seeing develop in the global north.
As just mentioned, I will talk a little bit about the value of wind. So many people are focusing on putting the cost of wind down, but we also have to make sure that the value of wind is also increasing in order to get more business opportunity, in order to make it more profitable, in order to drive the deployment and the operation of wind. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm coming from a country where we have liberalized our market way back in the 90s, so I will use some of my experience there to come up with some idea of how you actually increase the value of wind. As mentioned, I'm coming from a Technical University of Denmark. This work has been done within a project called Flex for S, so most of the slides you will have that logo on instead of the DTU logo, but there you see the DTU logo as well. So what I will do today is I will give you a little bit of the motivation for my speak. Then I'll use the Nordic countries, especially the Danish country, as a case study to show how it could look like in the future for other countries. And then say, okay, so how should wind become active in the market and what's in it? And I'll use that with some analytical cases and then open up for discussion of how to use it. So let's start with the motivation. If you look at the energy system, most places around the world, like in South Africa, has so far, or at least if you look a little bit back in the past, have been very centralized system based on fossil fuels with coal, oil, and etc. However, the green transition which is taking place in most places of the world is going towards more renewable energy like wind energy and solar energy. So it's going to be more decentralized system. And when you base this on mainly wind and solar, it will be more viable renewable energy compared to the more controllable fossil fuels plant we used to know. At the same time, if you want to get rid of fossil fuels, you also phase out some of the peak plants that you used to create flexibility in the system. So this is kind of what we see is going on. Some countries have already moved quite far. I'm coming from one of the countries where it moved quite far. Other countries are still in the beginning, but the tendency around the world is more or less the same. So we can actually use the experience from the countries that has moved far, have made all the errors, and you could learn of that, so you don't have to make the same errors as many other countries have done. When you look at the policy situation, normally there's three major targets in policy. First, of course, there's this reliability. You want to make sure that you have the power when you put in your plug into the wall and then have the electricity. This is one of the policy targets. You want, as a system, you want to make sure that everybody have a reliable electricity. On the other hand, you also want to have low prices to the consumers. That is mostly, at least in Europe, where I come from, said that they want competition, but it's the end product is energy for all at low prices. This is actually what it's about. And then the green transition is that you wanted to make it a sustainable system. It should also be there for our next generation. We should try to go to renewables instead of fossil fuels. So this is the policy challenge we normally have, or the policy targets. The way you handle this is normally, for example, if you look at a reliable system and you want to have low low prices with competition, is that you design a market. You design a market where demand and supply are meeting, so you are sure that all the time you have the electricity you need, and you don't have too little or you don't have too much. This is the major goal of the market. At the same time, the market is also where you have a dispatch at the lowest cost, a merit order cost normally. So you will have the lowest cost, and this is what normally we have as competition. So this is the way you handle this side of the triangle. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned, you want it to be sustainable. So this is where we actually see wind is coming in together with solar and hydropower, etc. I'll come back to that a little bit in a little while. When you put in a lot of viable renewable energy like wind and solar, you also put in some energy that is producing electricity as the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and it means that the rest of the system have to be very flexible in order to capture all this. So if you want a sustainable system and you still want a reliable system, you also need a lot of flexibility in the system. So this is the challenge. You need to have a market that is actually making this. You need a flexibility in the system. At the same time, you want to integrate a lot of wind. So this is where we kind of a framework for the talk. The idea here is, of course, not just to put it in. The idea here is to create value. If you talk with the wind industry, everybody else with interest in the wind, is that you want to have as much value for the wind as possible in order to make it profitable, drive the deployment, but also to create value for the society. If you think of wind as something uncontrollable, like you have hydropower run-off rivers where you just produce whenever there's wind or whenever there's water, then the cost is very low. The value of wind is very low because you don't use it optimally. Water, at least in the Nordic system, for hydropower, they found out 100 years ago and built a lot of dams. And at that time, they found out that they could actually control it much better and then increase the value of water. You can do the same with wind. And this is what I'm going to talk about, that you can try to control a little bit more and play a little bit with the market and then increase the value of wind. And so, but we have to figure out how to do it to create the right framework condition and do the right market design so you actually give the right incentive to the wind actors to become active and generate more value for them and for the society. So this is the idea. As mentioned, I'll use a Danish case here. Just for those of you who don't know Denmark very much, first of all, it's a country very far off in the north, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that currently we have 42 of our annual production coming from wind, and this is steadily increasing. So it means that we have quite a lot. Just within 2 years, we are going to more than 50% of the annual consumption coming from wind energy. And hopefully within 17 years from now, the entire electricity system will be covered by renewable energy. So we are decarbonizing the electricity system. And on the long term, we will decarbonize the entire system, so also the transport sectors, our heating sectors, and the gas sector would also be decarbonized. In doing that, we will do a lot of electrification of these sectors, means that the energy consumption for electricity will increase quite a lot, but this increase will also be covered by wind, and actually mostly wind. We'll also have a little bit of solar. So wind is really going to play a major role here. I just took some historical numbers just to show you. You see this is just quite old data, but just to show the graph. You see it goes up here to around 40% in 2012 of our annual consumption. but the variation is much larger. We have many hours in some part of Denmark where we have more than 100% of wind power generation, and of course we also have hours where it's much less than the annual production. So it creates challenge for the system, but it also creates value for the system, and this is what we're going to use. Let me see if I can go on. So our way of thinking about this is to introduce it in a market condition, because the market is what is actually driving the supply and demand, as I mentioned before, where they meet, so you make sure you have a reliable system. In the old days, we also always talking about making renewable market rated, so bring down the cost. But now when you have a high share like in Denmark, you twist it around, so instead of making renewable market rated, we make market renewable rated instead. So you have to design the market for renewables, markets that was originally designed for conventional coal power plants, etc. Now they have to be redesigned. One way that I believe we should do it is we should have the deployment of renewables being market driven. You can't have a market which will be dominated by renewables and then not have the renewables included in the market, then you don't have a market anymore. So you need to have them included in the market. So you also need not to have any market splitting. You shouldn't give priority process. They are very low cost technology, so they can survive. Don't worry about it. It also means that if you need to give support to renewables, if you need to have tendering procedures, auction, etc., you have to make sure that these are market-based, that the design of these instruments are market-based, so they're actually supporting the market in order to get a system that is actually reliable and not, as we just heard from Australia, that somebody from PV is still supplying even with negative prices. They should react to the market prices in order to have a market that is actually working. But it also means that, this said, we have to create new possibility. We have to allow the wind and the solar to be active at the market, so they actually see some incentive to be there. What we do is we use power exchange. I'll just take the case of Denmark again. The Danish power exchange is actually the Northern European power exchange. It started in the Nordic countries, but now it also includes some part of Germany and the Baltic countries and other countries. So it's quite big power exchange. The design of this is you have a day-ahead market, which we call the spot market, where you have the production plants putting in and you get some prices. Then you have at the real time, to the very right here, you have a balancing market, regulatory power market, that's what we call it, where you can actually, if you have some forecasting errors or whatever it is, then you can make corrections, so you make sure that there's a physical balance as well. So this is how it's working. And then between these two markets, there's an intraday market where you can adjust. If you can see, for example, you made a wind forecast and you see, okay, it's not going to blow, the wind is not going to blow the way you thought, and then you can actually adjust your bids, your production, and see if somebody's selling. The two big markets in the Nordic countries are the day-ahead market and the real-time balancing market over there. So this is also what I'm going to talk about. And as you see, the day-ahead market, it closes at noon the day before. So you actually made your bids at least 12 hours before and up to 36 hours before you're actually going to deliver it. And of course, that means something for wind energy when you have a certain production. Just to give you an example, also with respect to support system, I won't go into detail with the support system, but they have to be market-based, as I said, so they actually reflect the market value. In Denmark, we have tried everything. That's why you don't have to do the same mistake. One thing is that we want the producers to react to negative prices. The market design was changed in 2009, so they actually have negative prices if you have too much production. And of course, we also raised the price cap, so it actually can fluctuate and actually show the right signal. And it means that no one is curtailing, the system operator is not curtailing wind anymore. They haven't done it for 7, 8 years, because they actually react to prices. There are some cases there. And you can see this, the idea is, of course, that the wind up here should have a balance, and if they can't sell it to our neighboring countries, then they can actually, then you get the negative prices, and then you can actually curtail and then save money instead of. So this is the idea. Jumping on, if it works. I should never have went back. No, it doesn't work anymore. Funny. Now it works again. Good, I think I'll jump to some, no, I just have some illustration. This is just some illustration just to show it how it works. I won't go into detail. This is just from the spot market, the day-ahead market. You see this is just one wind farm, just to see how their profile, how they react. You see some negative prices here. The same prices you see down, the same time of the day you see here. And you see they actually shut down in order to save cost and thereby increasing their total revenue. And the same at the balancing market, they're also active at the balancing market. It's the same farm, it's different time periods though, but you have negative prices, meaning that they actually paid to close down. So they earn money by delivering a down-regulation service to the balancing market. So this is a good income. Okay, I jump fast now because I have a lyrical case. Oops. A reference case where they are passive, they just put it in. That could be a case where you have a system operator just taking all your production and you don't care about the market. But it also means that you might have to pay all the imbalanced services afterwards. They deduct that for your market value. And then I have three cases. One where you actually take into account that you know that you have some prediction uncertainty, and then you can take that into account by being active at the day-ahead market. And you can also take it into account by being active both at the day-ahead and the balance market. And finally, we can take just to show if you have perfect foresight, so there's no predicting uncertainty. Long story short, I rerun this with the market data for a couple of years just to show you how it was with some standard wind turbine just to show it. What you see here, if you don't do anything, you are passive, you actually have a penalty of your forecasting errors in not delivering exactly what you promised, and they actually deduct it from your total revenue. If you take that into account in your bidding on the balancing market, you can actually turn it to a positive value. If you make it more strategically, so you're bidding strategically, knowing the different uncertainties, and knowing that after you have bid on the spot market, you have 12 hours to come with additional bids where you can actually deliver balanced service, then you increase quite a lot. And if you have perfect foresight, you could actually change it quite a lot. The perfect foresight is not realistic, it's just to show it. What we see, this is the results and my findings, and then I'll stop, is that going from the passive case to just being active in the spot market, it increased the value of wind a little bit, 1%. It's not much. But going from passive case where you're actually just delivering into the system and actually taking the uncertainty and the market condition into account increases, in this case, with the Danish number with 8%. So there's a huge number compared to just being passive. And this would be my findings. So just summing up, we see that the system in the future will be more market integrated. I didn't do anything here. And there will be need for more flexibility. We can actually turn that to a value. We can do it by increasing the value of wind by, don't touch anything. By being active at both the day-ahead market and the spot market. I didn't talk about asymmetric price, but if you have asymmetric price, you would normally have that to balance the market because it's more expensive to upregulate than downregulate. Then you be even more strategically, but that's another talk. This is important not only for a country where this has gone that far as in Denmark, but it's also important for future development on power exchanges around the world, that you actually take that into account if you want a lot of solar and wind in the system. Because the more you implement this, the more value you create for a system, and then you actually make it more optimal. I think I'm more or less done. Just to give you an indication, just to finalize the final remarks. Why this is also important is that when you talk with people who make optimal design of wind turbines, they might talk about increasing or decreasing the cost by 1 or 2%. By making the right market design, you might increase the value to 10%, 8%, whatever. So it is really something that matters for wind. Sorry, my time is up, I think.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Skytte? Yes, over there, sir. Is Mike coming? Please just introduce yourself as well.
I'm Trésor. I would like just to ask, it's so difficult to pronounce your name. Okay, it's fine. I would like to ask, according to your presentation, did you make some implementation in smart grid environment? Because if I try to pitch up any single slide, it means all of your presentation is under smart grid area, under smart grid development, under smart grid thought, under smart grid, I can say under smart grid development, because I can see whatever, when I read also your topic from passive to active, when we want to cut the passive management, the passive strategy of energy control to active, mostly nowadays is under smart grid development and smart grid deployment. I would like just to ask if all of your projects, it was developed under smart grid, or maybe is...
No, it's not developed under smart grid, but of course you can deploy wind both at the local level and at the high voltage level. If you have, for example, offshore, it's at a high voltage level, and in that case, it normally don't call it smart grid, because normally you have smart grid at a local level. But of course, this also this is also important for the smart grid, because you can control it. And in Denmark, normally, if you have only single wind turbines, you actually bid it into some kind of aggregators that is doing the trade on the power exchange for you in a smart way. So you can easily implement in the smart grid as well. Yeah.
I'm Akinola Jayobi. My question is, what's the role of government subsidy in how profitable wind development is? Because I was reading a while back that there are some governments that actually subsidize wind development and stuff, but I noticed you didn't include that in your...
No, we used to have a lot of subsidy in Denmark, but one of the idea of increasing the value of wind is actually also to make it more profitable to run wind at market condition only. And in the last, I mean, we have had a lot of, we have tried everything. We have tried feed-in tariff, feed-in premiums, auction, tendering, etc. And some of the last tendering procedure for offshore wind had actually turned out to a zero support scheme, because they can actually survive on market condition. But it's only because they're allowed to be active, because they create value by being active as well. If you didn't have that, you needed still additional subsidy. But in this case, you don't. Wind is competitive.
Hi, I'm Johan Stander from the Energy Center CSIR. Very interesting presentation. Just one question. When South Africa has 50% wind, okay, and we can't really export our energy to other countries, or we can't really import energy from other countries, how would you change how could we go about adding value in that setup?
But that would be even more important, because then if you don't import or export, you will be more like an island, like we heard from Australia, and it would be even more important that it actually react to the price signal, wouldn't it? Because if you import and export a lot, then you will just use your neighboring country as buffer. But here, if you run it more in an island mode, then you will have to use all the generation and consumption inside that island mode to be flexible. And this is what you do by having a market where you actually get the right signal out, and they should react, of course.
Hi, I'm Richard, and I would like to know if you've thought about how a situation like South Africa's, where we don't have a liberalized market, and so the market only applies at the point of bidding, right, in the bidding windows.
Yeah.
Within a system like this, whose responsibility might it be to drive these kind of developments, or can you see any analogous driver to optimization of the system value of wind?
As I see it, the value of wind is more or less the same. But in a system where you just feed it into the system, somebody else is taking the risk and also is taking the additional value if there is any value. So the value is more or less the same, but you don't give the incentive to the wind producers to actually act. And in that case, I don't think it's the optimal one if you had that as a case. But you can still use it as an argument when you're making a tendering procedure or anything else. Then the way you design your auction could be, instead of just getting a fixed feed-in tariff, you could get a feed-in premium or something like that. So you actually still have the price that shines through, or something like that. So you can still use it as an argument, I would argue.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to present a part of our work which has been jointly elaborated between Fraunhofer EWES and the CSIR for the LCOE part. Most of the work has been carried out by Joan Stender, and I have just the pleasure to present it to you. Well, the first thing I want to summarize in the beginning is the results of the South African wind aggregation study, just to put on the framework in which frame we have discussed this LCOE and why, and also what kind of question has been arose from this study. Then I will go into more detail on the database we are using, compare some different data sources we used, show some figure of LCOE, and go on more in detail of the limitation and the meaning of LCOE, and give you a summary. Well, in fact, the South African solar and wind aggregation study was a joint project between CSIR and Fraunhofer, and has been supported by several other institutions, SANEDI, ESCOM, and so on and so forth. We wanted to qualify the wind potential of South Africa, and we wanted to present the effects of a spatial distribution or a spatial concentration of wind, of both solar PV and wind in South Africa. Do it make sense, install all the capacity on one single site, or spread it equally around the country? The data source we used was the Vasa data. I think they have already mentioned yesterday and presented there. And we had, what we found out as general findings of the study was, well, South Africa is one of the best countries to apply both solar PV and wind energy. It has an enormous potential. It has enough space to do it. It's very cost effective in South Africa. And if you look on the smoothing effects due to the size of the country, you have very, very good smoothing effects, which helps to solve grid integration issues. Now, coming to one of the input data, it's just a wind speed map. It's more or less the radar data showing that, well, for sure there are some better sites indicated in red, and some worse sites indicated in blue around the country. The data source we used has a spatial resolution of 5 by 5 kilometer, and there the first question came into the discussion: is this resolution sufficient for doing LCOE studies or not? So we try to answer it. We I think there are different application for this question. It's just evaluate the LCOE of single farms. For example, to have a bankable study and demonstrate it makes sense to install it like there. And on the other hand, we have the system studies like this South African wind integration study. What we did with this wind speed data was to convert it to energy, and finally we sorry for that, we calculated a capacity factor. You see, we applied 5 different turbines depending on the local condition in this 5 by 5 kilometer grid all over South Africa. We just looked what's the mean wind speed, which turbine of this 5 generic turbines would fit best to this site. You see, it's very high capacity factor of above 0.35 compared to some European countries, for example, Spain, the Spanish case, or the German case. You see, we have much less wind than you in South Africa. We in Germany have already about 50 gigawatt wind energy installed and running, and so it works and it makes sense even with this bad capacity factor. So it should make more sense in South Africa. Well, in addition to this VASA modeling, we also had some measurement site, this 10 measurement site, where we have really local measurements. It's point measurements, so it's valid for this certain point. The VASA data are more or less valid for a 5 by 5 kilometer area. So we compare on the one hand side an area with a point. So you will see also the deviation and later on. What we here we go. What we did is just comparing all values we have for 4 years. What the difference in the distribution and so on and so forth, and calculated something like a mean. So I took out the worst of the sites. There we have really a big deviation between the weather model, the VASA model, and the ground-based station. So we have about 10% deviation of this two. We have better sites already. So the question was, what will this do with our LCOE calculation for single sites or an area? That was one question. One question. Now I come just to some to the cost of renewable energy in South Africa. It's just indicating the results of the 4th bid window in South Africa. There you see the cheapest sources of solar PV and wind are there. Coal and the other options are quite more expensive. But it's just the bid. It's not really the levelized cost of electricity. So it's a market-driven price and not considered a free cost. So I come to the general description. What is the LCOE? You can state. Sorry. It's just lifetime cost divided by energy production for sure. And the lifetime costs include a lot of different costs. Generally speaking, it contains CAPEX, OPEX, and also maintenance costs, and subtract some incentives there. I will go not into too much detail. You can, for a single turbine, you can do it very, very detailed. You can really consider all CAPEX cost of every single part of a turbine. So you end up with a lot of cost assumptions. And for sure, this is very good to do it if you need a bankable result, a bankable study. But it will not be suitable for a countrywide study, just to look at every single turbine aspects there. So Other limitations of more general limitations for the LCOE thing is the capex costs. Well, there are some limitations because some unforeseen events may happen. Also, normally we assume a fixed estimate for during the lifetime. To go into more detail, we will have trends in rates, we have trends in costs, and so on and so forth. You see, it gets quite complex, the LCOE calculation, but still it has other problems. Also with the energy calculation, there are some inaccuracies and so on. You have coming from the technology itself, your variation in the power curve, also the estimation of maybe the wind speed at a certain point is not so good. Like I mentioned before, it may be a complex site, then you have a lot of deviation for that. So you see, often mentioned is LCOE, but it's quite a complex figure for that. And there are a few more obstacles for LCOE, especially thinking on a system basis, because normally LCOE does not contain any system costs. So it means you have just the production costs normally in this costs integrated, but not the countrywide system costs, and that's the most important thing for designing a future energy system. And also it gives the indication how to design the support scheme and so on. Also, therefore, sometimes it's better for system design, system study to calculate the avoided cost of energy. It's a model introduced by some colleagues of US and used there broadly. It's just looking what is happening with the system cost if you introduce some more energy into the system. Put some more wind, what happened with the overall cost. So it's quite nice because you have already included the system cost in that. Unfortunately, we didn't have the chance for the study to really use that. There we used the LCOE for the cost estimation. But for further work, it's good to keep this method quite in mind. Well, coming back to the South African wind and solar aggregation study and what we did there. Like I mentioned, you can calculate the LCOE in very much detail. It makes sense for a single site, a single wind farm, if you really have need a high accuracy for that. We drawed very easy assumptions for that. We put some costs for each of these 5 wind turbines. We have assumption that about 80% of all the overall costs as capex costs, and we had the assumption, which is coming from historical data, that our turbine type 5, which is a turbine for very low wind speed sites, is about 20% much expensive than this one for the strong wind speed sites. And then we calculated a relative LCOE. It's indicated there. That means 100% is an average cost there. If we go into, if we in a green area, the cost for electricity are less than the average cost, so it's better, and red it's more expensive sites. So what we did next was we took the comparison I showed you before and added all pixels with a comparable wind speed in order to have a certain benchmark. For this bad site, we ended up that the deviation of LCOE even increased to 15%. we did it for all these 10 measurement sites that you see in complex area on near the shoreline. We have a lot of difference if looking on a single site or looking on the 5 by 5 kilometer square LCOE. But nevertheless, in average, we ended up with a very low deviation between all sites. So for countrywide studies, it's just sufficient to do it there. Because I run out of time, I will skip this and come to the conclusions. The LCOE model with this relative LCOE is suitable for countrywide system studies. For bankable export opinions, it's a more detailed model, really site-specific is needed. Well, and to repeat it again, South Africa has some of the world best sites for both solar PV and wind application. I didn't show you the graph yet, but we also draw the conclusion that the extension of on transmission level, especially on substation level, is not first issue. It will be needed in 10 years ahead or something like that. But on substation level, it's still possible to integrate a lot of solar PV and wind. What we didn't analyze during the course of the study was distribution grids, and in my opinion, it's a great market in South Africa, and it's very important to go further with with both solar PV and wind, because it's the cheapest option for this country. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Bofinger?
Thanks for that fascinating input. You went very quickly over the LACE, levelized avoided cost of electricity supply, but it sounds like it could be quite an interesting one for us here.
Yeah.
Could you just unpack it a little bit? Because from what I saw there, it looked like, I'm not sure how it would be different for different technologies or different power producers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that question. I hand over to my colleague Johan Stander from CSIR. He can explain better than myself.
I'm not an expert on LACE in any means. So basically what LACE shows you and what you want the LACE to be less or equal to LCOE. So that is, it's like the negative of system cost. It's costs avoided if you install wind or solar PV. Okay. There's a paper link, and I can easily give you that paper. The bottom line is, you want to have a LACE lower than or equal to COLE. That's, I'm not entirely... How do you calculate it? The formula, I'll share the formula with you, and you can, but I'll make it a public available in any case. Yeah. I hope I answer your question. To some extent, yeah. All right, that's it. Okay.
Any further questions?
Stefan, based on your studies, is it possible to actually create a supply curve as one moves from one pixel to the next pixel, so enlarging the area where you're putting your wind farm? Because now, as you increase, for example, hypothetically, you might start with a higher load factor on a 5 by 5 kilometer pixel, but then as you increase that pixel to cover a larger area, say 25 by 25, you might find that your load factor reduces. Are you able to increment your supply curve based on the movement of the pixels, enlarging your area incrementally?
Well, in fact, we did a calculation for each of this 5 by 5 kilometer square pixel, assume certain extent of the wind farms. This, I think it's quite good described in the final report of the South African wind aggregation study, and that one is available, or still available on the CSIR site. There you can have a look on the detailed calculation of the wind to power conversion, also about shading losses between the single wind turbines and so on. Does this answer your question?
To almost the end of the day, I hope that I keep it interesting for you this afternoon. As he mentioned, I come all the way from Northeastern University in Boston. My research generally focuses on indigenous rights, renewable energy development, and climate change. So today, I'd like to take you to Mexico. I think yesterday there was a speaker who took us to the north. I'm going to take you to a little bit of a warmer place. And I want to talk about the liberalization of Mexico's energy markets. We've had a little bit of conversation about markets already. And I'll focus on the capacity auctions that have been the cornerstone of Mexico's energy reform project. And I also want to discuss some of the indigenous rights concerns that emerge from the design of the auctions. And I'd like to introduce to you all the framework of energy democracy, which is under the broader umbrella of energy justice. It's an emerging field of study, but it's also a global movement, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll present sort of the working framework for my energy, just energy auction model that is specifically geared toward Mexico. Okay, so I promised I would take you down south. Last year I had the fortune of doing a Fulbright research grant, or having funding to do research under the Fulbright program in the United States. I'm down in Mexico. And in September of last year, I found myself in a conference room in the Sheraton Hotel in Mexico City, about to embark on a meeting with the Secretary of Energy in Mexico, Sener, and other academics, other members of the NGO community, and we were there to talk about shared social benefits for energy projects. And just as the presentation got underway, there was a panel of maybe 5 people in front, a room very much like this. Just as it got underway, about 40 people from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca filed into the room. And these were farmers, women with children, grandmothers, grandfathers, who were protesting the extensive wind development that had occurred in the Isthmus. So that was the beginning of my research project. You can see one of the signs there, basically protesting the extensive wind development that has already occurred in Oaxaca. The folks who came into the room started their started their protest by saying, "We were not invited to this meeting, but we came anyway." And again, I mentioned there were academics, representative NGOs, government officials who were at this meeting. So this is what happened to the front of the room as this group filed in. And for the duration of this 2-day meeting to discuss shared benefits for renewable energy projects all over Mexico, the people who had not been invited actually lined up around the room, around the periphery, which sort of illustrates the dynamic, the development dynamic occurring in Mexico, where there are outsiders and there are insiders who are discussing outcomes that relate to those outside of them. Oh, the colors got all washed out on this. Okay, well, so this is supposed to be a wind map of Mexico, of Oaxaca. And I'll just go ahead and lay out some of the statistics so you have an idea. This map was put together by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, to illustrate just how hard the wind blows in Oaxaca. So positionality is important. Oaxaca is, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is essentially this little waistband here that separates the Atlantic Ocean from the Pacific Ocean. And if the colors were showing up, you'd see bands of purple, bright purple, kind of throughout this isthmus region. So by many estimates, the wind blows in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec harder than almost anywhere in the world. And so because of this, it has become a site of extensive wind development over the last decade. Oaxaca, as a state, is the second poorest state in the country of Mexico, which itself is a developing country. So if that gives you an idea of the poverty there, it's pretty extensive. And there are also no fewer than 14 indigenous groups that live in this state. And these are indigenous groups that speak specific and distinct indigenous languages. And as I mentioned, over the last decade, there has been an extensive amount of wind development in this area. There are around 22, some estimate up to 25, around 22 wind projects that have been developed in just the last decade. And this region has around 80% of the wind development for all of Mexico. So that's extensive concentrated development that has occurred over a very short time. We're talking about around 1,800 megawatts of power in a very small region. And one of the largest projects in Latin America, called Eólica del Sur, Wind of the South, 132 wind turbine project that takes up around a little bit over 5,000 hectares, and that's 396 megawatts. So I knew that I would at least get some of the engineers in the room with the talk about megawatts. But suffice it to say that this is a region that is impoverished and also experiencing a wind boom. And unfortunately, none of the wind development and the electricity that comes from it actually benefits the local people. Energy poverty is extensive in the region, meaning that people can't afford electricity and just can't access it and don't have access to power. And you can see there the wind turbines kind of in the background against this community region. Okay. So I want to set that up because that's the backdrop for this research project. Mexico realizes that it will be impacted due to climate change. The climate change impacts are significant, including desertification, sea level rise, and extreme weather events that we've already begun to see around the world. Because of that, Mexico has positioned itself as a leader amongst its peers in the global south with respect to climate change reform. And so, in fact, the country has embarked on a pretty extensive climate reform legal project. Starting in 2009, in fact, the country started to think about climate change legislation, and in 2012, it passed the General Law on Climate Change. There's also an interministerial commission on climate change and a national climate change strategy. And so part of the strategy is to reduce the amount of coal and gas that is used to power the country. By 2018, the country has a goal of producing all of its energy through clean energy sources, and that includes natural gas. So that's a little bit complicated. By 2021, that goes up to 30%. By 2024, that's 35%. And 2036, 45% of energy needs to come from clean energy, clean sources. And 2050, that jumps up to 60%. And so right now, the country's at in 2017, the country's at 12%. So we're talking about a significant jump between now and 2050 in order to get energy sources from clean, or create energy from clean energy sources. Okay, so that is the backdrop. And how exactly is it going to do that? Well, through low carbon development, through resilience. I'm not sure what resilience means. I'm always curious when those terms are like sustainability and resilience are thrown around. And then also inclusive policy. But the real way in which Mexico plans to do this is through an extensive energy reform project. So hand in hand with this aggressive climate change mission, the country has embarked on an energy reform project, which started in 2013. And so for the first time since 1938, the country has opened up its energy markets for private participation. And so we're talking about a neoliberal development model where we rely on private actors to engage in the development project. We're also talking about increased private participation, and I'll talk a little bit about how that is being done through the auctions, increased competition, of course, to drive down prices, and then, of course, Oil and gas are in the shadows here. Mexico has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. And so Pemex, which was the state-run energy company, oil and gas company, has been beleaguered for many years now, and many see the reform as a way to sort of save Pemex and actually extract some of the extensive oil and gas reserves. I don't focus on oil and gas in my research. I'm mainly focused on electricity and renewables. So electricity is the cornerstone of, or the focus of this talk, but you should know that there's a lot going on in the oil and gas sector as well. Okay, so I just want to go through the structure of the reform a bit so that you have an idea of how this is unfolding. I know many of you are very immersed in the South African context, and I'd love to talk to you either during Q&A or after this presentation if you want to provide some insights. So on both the hydrocarbon and the electricity side, we're talking about market creation, again, to drive down the cost of electricity and oil and gas. This is done through the auction process, or tendering process, procurement process, depending on where you come from. And there also is an environmental assessment required for both the hydrocarbon side and the electricity side when we're talking about renewable energy development. With respect to the environmental impact assessments, those are available publicly, and there are actually plenty of hearings where people get to hear about the environmental impacts of proposed projects. It gets complicated when we think about social impacts. Those studies are also required in connection with development. Again, they're required after the project has been selected. Unfortunately, getting access to those documents is very tricky. On the oil and gas side, I talked to officials at Center. They're thinking about making those social impact studies available to the public on a pretty readily available basis. But on the electricity side, unfortunately, those documents we have to request, and often you're denied access to that. So I want to move to the energy auctions themselves, the electricity auctions themselves. Okay, so I think as you mentioned in the intro, auctions are becoming all the rage. And in fact, a study conducted by IRENA provided that between 2009 and 2013, the number of countries engaged in auctions grew from 9 countries to 44. And most of those auction countries are in the global south, so they're developing countries. In Mexico, the auctions are designed, as I mentioned, to drive down prices, so the lowest bidder wins. And the project development we're talking about is rapid. So from the time they win the auction, they have 2 years to get the project operational. So that's an extraordinary amount of time. I come from the project finance world. That to me sounds like a very short amount of time. The first auctions were in 2016, and we're looking at 2018 as the launch for many of these projects. We're talking about large-scale projects, so 5 megawatts and beyond, mega projects by many people's estimations. Some of the projects have been quite controversial, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the proposals. But again, this is all in the effort of bringing as much renewable energy online as quickly as possible. So last year, I had the pleasure of spending most of my time in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's the state here. The Yucatan Peninsula itself is a peninsula, and I have a slide on actually the position of it, and so you can see what the peninsula is. But the state of Yucatan was deemed one of the biggest winners in the first electricity auction of March of 2016. So much so that the auction of 2016 was deemed the Yucatan auction. So out of the 18 projects that were awarded contracts in 2016, 9 of them came from the Yucatan. And so I mentioned Oaxaca at the outset because of the extensive energy development taking place there. Many in the Yucatan fear that some of the same dynamics will occur where the community is not in support of projects in the Yucatan Peninsula. So a lot of people are focused on the Yucatan to see how the projects themselves unfold. Let's see. I want to move a little bit quickly. I know I have only a couple more minutes. So there's some tension in the auction design itself. Before we go into the specifics of the Yucatan Peninsula, there's heavy reliance on technical and financial data in order to select winners. And so the state puts out requirements for the bids. But the only criteria at this point are technical and financial, and they don't have any social or other policy instruments embedded within them. Some countries do use auctions to achieve certain policy ends. There's no opportunity for prior engagement by communities where those projects are proposed. There's also a focus on low cost, which excludes community projects at the outset, given that the cost of capital is so high and often communities don't have access to capital in order to do their own projects. And then, of course, the area of interest to me is indigenous rights. And there is a doctrine, in fact, that is not necessarily being followed in these auctions. So just to kind of go back to the positionality of the Yucatan so you get a sense of the place, many people know about the Yucatan because of Cancun. Who in here has heard of Cancun? Okay, sunny beaches, the Caribbean, beautiful place. The Yucatan Peninsula, but not exactly Yucatan State. Cancun is here in the state of Quintana Roo. This is the state of Yucatan as I'm outlining. And this is a tourist map. I like this map because it shows these little triangles dotted around the peninsula. Those triangles actually are not just decoration, those are pyramids. And so this area is home to a large portion of indigenous people. And so this is a map that was put together by the Center for the Development of Indigenous People in Mexico. And the red indicates where indigenous people live. As I mentioned, Oaxaca is home to many indigenous groups. That has the highest number of indigenous people in the country, but the Yucatan Peninsula also has an extensive amount of number of indigenous people living there. And it is has the third highest number of indigenous people, around 1 million people out of 2,000. So around 40% of the population is indigenous in the Yucatan. This map also is from the Center for Development of Indigenous People, for Indigenous Development. This is a map that shows little red dots where indigenous people are located, and the communities are comprised of greater than 40% indigenous people. So again, the Yucatan Peninsula is full of indigenous people. And this map shows the extensive development that is underway. And so as I mentioned, some of the development dynamic in Mexico is that there are outsiders and people who are not engaged in the development process and the project of development, and those who are engaged. And so here, this is kind of hard to see, but you can see the yellow writing to indicate where the various projects are taking place. I'll highlight the particularly problematic project that I talked about called Tikul. That is a 500 megawatt project in the forest for solar. And so we're talking about hundreds of hectares being cut down in the name of clean energy. And many people in this area, throughout the Yucatan, many indigenous people here rely on beekeeping to support their way of life. So we know that the development in the Yucatan will be extensive, and the question is whether we can adhere to indigenous rights principles. And so quickly, there's a doctrine of indigenous rights that is international, that protects the rights of indigenous people to be consulted in connection with development. And this is all types of development, including renewable energy. The doctrine is called Free Prior Informed Consent. It grew out of the International Labor Organization Convention of 1991, of which Mexico was one of the first signatories, which basically said that indigenous people needed to be consulted with the goal of getting their consent with respect to renewable energy, not renewable energy, development projects. So ILO 169 was consultation with the goal of getting their consent. And then finally in 2007, the UN adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was a high watermark for indigenous rights. And that actually enshrined the doctrine of free prior informed consent when we're dealing with energy projects. And this is important in the climate change era when we're going to the very communities that had nothing to do with creating the problem of climate change and asking them to bear the burden of housing a lot of renewable energy projects, particularly in the global south. I'd like to introduce the energy democracy frame as a possible way out of this. And I think it's pretty obvious to me that the goals of consent for indigenous communities are kind of at odds with the way the market is designed, particularly in Mexico. Energy democracy is one way to perhaps sort of parse through this and maybe get toward consistency with free, prior, informed consent. Energy democracy is an emerging frame. It's also a global movement. There are scholars in my field in law that are starting to write about energy democracy. It's also across other disciplines in the social sciences. It's pretty new, so within the last 5 years or so. So there's a lot of, so we're still trying to understand what it means and how we can operationalize its principles. Energy democracy essentially requires that that communities have a say in shaping what their energy future looks like. It also, many of the tenets suggest that communities should own their own energy. And again, this is an emerging global movement. This is also an emerging theoretical framework. But I think it would be useful for determining or for creating auctions that are consistent with the principles of free, prior, informed consent. And so I just want to lay out a couple proposals, actually a handful. This is very much a work in progress, but one that I hope I get some feedback on in this venue. So one way to get around this using principles of energy democracy would be to engage communities early and often in the, with respect to the bids. So companies would actually have the obligation to engage with communities prior to submitting a bid, and that would be baked into the auction as well, some sort of check on that engagement. I would also argue that environmental and social assessments, as well as FPIC certifications, be done before a bidder can participate in an auction. I know that's controversial, adding some costs for the bidders. I think there should also be a small project carve-out for certain community projects that would be more consistent with the principles of free, prior, informed consent. We're seeing this in other jurisdictions. Germany has extended its timeline for project completion beyond the 2-year window for community energy projects. I think that would get at some of the problems we're seeing with community engagement. I think there could also be community project waivers. So all of the technical and financial criteria might be waived, or some of them might be waived in order to entice developers within the community to participate in auctions. And that could also lead to greater engagement by indigenous people in the development process. Or we could also create separate separate energy auctions that are focused on community energy projects that more fully engage communities in the development process. And finally, at the equity level, we can require that project developers include community carve-outs in their equity modeling to allow for deeper participation of indigenous people and also communities within the development process. So this is a slate of proposals. I recognize they're controversial, and I'd love to get your input. So thank you for your attention.
The picture where you had the wind technology on top of the roof of the community really moved me. I think this serves as an opportunity to my learned colleagues or friends here to consider this type of option, especially in the disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And the wind turbines weren't exactly on the roofs, but they were in the shadow. And so that was more juxtaposing the poverty in the community with the extensive development that's all around. And the communities are not really able to access that. But yeah, but thank you for your comment. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Leroy. I'm from Rhodes University. I'm kind of perplexed in the sense that when you look at it in the South African context, the green economy is essentially about alleviating poverty and to provide jobs. So essentially being sustainable. But then when you look at like in the Mexican context, basically you have this extensive program going on, but like you're not really helping the community. So the focus is a bit different when you look at it like that. So I'm just kind of like confused and like perplexed in that sense.
You're as confused as I am. I mean, I mean, this is, I think one of the great opportunities of this transition that we're all talking about and that we're all engaged in is the opportunity to transform economies as well, right? And to include as many people in that transition as possible. And so there are avenues for participation. We've seen excellent examples from Germany and Denmark where communities create their own projects. There is a capacity issue as well in terms of getting folks access to capital, making sure that there's technical expertise to actually get community energy projects off the ground. But one of the things I didn't mention in the Oaxacan context is that projects were stopped. There is a social risk for development and developers when they don't engage communities in the development project. And so one way to sort of get at that is to include communities not only in the planning of projects, but other benefits can be achieved through the development process as well. Not necessarily, I mean, if equity seems like too much, perhaps it's some other way to share the benefit along the road. But engaging communities from the outset is imperative so that eventually they can also participate in this process. So great comment and question.
I work with people in what we call the Energy Governance Network, civil society folks. And so thank you for reminding us that people do feature in academic work associated with the wind industry. Really encouraging. It's good to be reminded that good intentions, things done with the best of intentions, don't always wind up delivering net social value if they're not responsive to the local context. But you've talked about just energy auctions, in other words, bringing justice into the auction process. Have you found much resonance with the energy democracy community in actually taking this approach when some people would prefer an approach that doesn't even involve auctioning at all? How are you managing that, or how are they managing that tension?
Right, I think that's such a great question. So this is a pretty new project for me, and I just came out of Mexico just a couple months ago, really. And one of the big issues that I identified there was the auction model and the way that it sort of just squeezes out because it privileges capital and privileges low-cost capital. So I'm also agnostic about auctions themselves. Based on the trends, it seems that auctions are not going anywhere and that they're here to stay. And so given that, I'm willing to work within those confines to figure out how we can make them more just. And there are places where there is experimentation happening, I think, rooted in or starting from the grassroots community. Victoria, Australia, has begun to think about ways to configure their auctions in a way that is more just. Some of these recommendations come from that, their work as well. Germany, I know they're trying to include more community participation, given some of the failures and given some of the outcry from communities based on the way the auctions were designed in the past. So I think there is a global movement. Again, I don't know the auctions are going to go away. I would argue that they're problematic as well. So we'll see. To be continued.
I think I'd like all of you to join me in thanking Professor Baker for her contribution and her questions.